Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar. The name of the webinar is Education Success for Youth in the Juvenile Justice System. Pardon my pause there. I was having a little bit of a technical difficulty. And this webinar is presented to you by the Legal Center for Youth Justice and Education. Our presenters today are Maura McInerney, Senior Staff Attorney from Education Law Center, Christina Moon, Staff Attorney at Education Law Center, and unfortunately not able to present today, but who did contribute to this webinar and the materials is Waikita Tovar, Zubra Fellow at Juvenile Law Center. Before we get started, I just want to make sure that everyone can clearly hear me and as the audio is coming through all right. So if you could take a moment to type in the chat box. Great, thank you. It looks like the audio is good, and a couple of people commented that you can't see anything. We are not yet sharing the slides, but we will do so momentarily, so you should be able to see the slides in just a few seconds. This webinar is being recorded, and we will send a link to the video recording in a follow-up email in a few days. If you are participating by phone today, your line will be muted during the entire webinar. We will try to save some time at the end of the webinar to answer your questions. And you can type those into the questions or the chat box that's part of the GoToWebinar control panel. And so without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn the webinar over to Maura.
Thanks so much, Chelsea, and thanks to everyone for being on the call today. I really appreciate your time. I know it's a difficult period of time when a lot of folks are, sorry, I'm going to show my screen there, when many people are busy, so we appreciate your time during this last week before the holidays. So today's webinar is Education Success for Youth in the Juvenile Justice System, and as Chelsea mentioned, it's brought to you by the Legal Center for Youth Justice and Education. We are a collaboration, a national collaboration of the Southern Poverty Law Center, the Juvenile Law Center, Education Law Center Pennsylvania, and the American Bar Association Center on Children in the Law. If you want to learn more about about each of our 8 organizations, you can go online and learn more that way. But I wanted to explain that our mission, which is our mission statement there, is to ensure that all youth in and returning from the juvenile and criminal justice systems access a quality education. So we're building collaboratives among juvenile justice and education professionals. We're also trying to highlight innovative model litigation strategies as well as policies, both at the state and federal level, as well as working with you as collaborators to reshape federal, state, and local policies. There may be some people on the call who are familiar with the Legal Center for Foster Care and Education, which is a national collaborative of JLC, ABA, Center on Children in the Law, and ELC. And we also have a website called fostercareeducation.org. You may be familiar with our blueprint for change for children in the foster care system, which articulates 8 goals and benchmarks for children in the child welfare system, and also has a searchable database. And in many ways, the Legal Center for Youth Justice and Education is similarly has developed a blueprint for change for children who are in the juvenile justice system. So what we know about children who are in juvenile justice placements, we believe they are perhaps the most educationally disadvantaged of all student groups. And we know from our experience that many youth re-entering community schools from juvenile justice placements commonly struggle to graduate, and many will drop out of school. So as reflected here, there are 70,000 students who are in custody in juvenile justice system on any given day, a total of 1.7 million delinquency cases adjudicated nationwide. Nearly 2/3 of youth in juvenile justice placements are Black and Latino. And I know that many on this call probably work on dismantling the school-to-prison pipeline. And just to underscore that youth of color are 3.5 times more likely to be suspended than their white peers for similar conduct in school. So we see that disproportionality really driving who we see in the juvenile justice system and who are in JJ placements. Nearly half of all students who enter residential JJ placements are below grade equivalent for their age. Many have a history of truancy and grade retention. And they're 3 to 7 times more likely to be identified as eligible for special education services. There's a lot of debate as to whether children are over-identified who are in the juvenile justice system, and then there are also concerns that some children are not identified who are placed in the juvenile justice system, but that issue comes up a lot. While a youth is in a juvenile justice placement, these are regional studies. I apologize for the echo. I don't know what's going on there. Okay. Fewer than 25% receive special education services, although 1/3 have diagnosed learning disabilities. That's based on some regional studies that have been undertaken in various states and jurisdictions. There's little evidence of improvement in reading or math when students have been tested when they enter a juvenile justice facility and then when they leave. And fewer than half who are enrolled for at least 90 days earn 1 or more course credits while in placement schools. I think a lot of us are familiar with the problems of earning credits when you're in a short-term placement, or earning credits that are recognized towards graduation, which is a huge problem for youth in the juvenile justice system. Only 9% of students ages 16 to 21 are on track to earn a high school diploma or a GED. But there's a lot we don't know about the quality of education provided in these placements. We do know that many placement schools are not accredited and/or are infrequently monitored by states, something that may change under some of the new provisions of ESSA. So information about the schools and the quality of education provided is often unknown to families, to advocates, to courts, in part because these placements often are not properly sufficiently monitored at the state level. Moreover, too often youth are placed very far away from their communities and families. There have been a number of studies that have underscored the fact that this is very detrimental to youth, to have them placed far from their communities. It undermines their academic growth, and it really puts them sort of off track. Only 23 states place youth in nationally accredited schools that participate in their state's accountability system at the current time. Approximately 40% of detained students are educated in privately run facilities, and only 20% of states collect the same outcome data from these private facilities as they do from state-run facilities. So most significantly, these facilities are most often monitored solely for special education, which may occur on a cyclical basis and may occur perhaps as it does in Pennsylvania, almost every 6 years with respect to a placement, and only with regard to whether they're providing a free, appropriate public education for students. So it's a huge issue that there's a lot we don't know about the quality of education being provided in these placements. So in terms of barriers to school success, while in placement, there are often delays in the transfer of education records coming from a community school. There are not timely, accurate assessment of the needs of students. That is something that was called out in the new revisions to ESSA that we're going to talk about today. But that's a big issue, that assessments are not being done on the needs of students as they enter the placements. Unmet special education needs, as was noted in the prior slide. There's sometimes an overuse of cyber learning. Students are not being kept on track with grade level. They may be given something that's called 9th grade work, but it's in fact maybe elementary school work that is given to them, in part because they are not required to meet the same state standards as a public school. There's a lack of coordination between sort of learning and teaching and what they know when they're coming in and what are their deficiencies. There's an inconsistency in curricula, again, because so many of them are private placements that do not need to comply with state standards. So 9th grade algebra does not have to consist of the same curricula. We also have underqualified teachers who are in these placements, and according to the study of the Southern Education Foundation, methods are often inappropriate, outdated, or inadequate. And upon return to a home or community school, we often see delays in enrollment and the transfer of education records from the facility. And very often these youth are placed in a much more restrictive environment upon return. Often you hear about students being placed in a disciplinary setting solely by virtue of the fact that they're coming from a juvenile justice placement, which is something that's been challenged in several states. So it may be that they're placed in an alternative education for disruptive youth, even though that school did not have jurisdiction of them in order to place them there. A lot of credits are not transferring or they don't count towards graduation. Again, the curriculum and the state standards vary, so we often see students who receive a poor quality education while in a juvenile justice placement, and when they come back, they sometimes feel that they've been successful in that placement, that they're doing well, and sadly, tragically, often the bottom drops out. So we're going to do a little overview of legal rights and protections for these youth. I would say that probably most of the litigation has occurred under the IDEA because there are many students who qualify for special education services, and most often the kinds of cases we see in that context are a failure to provide a free appropriate public education, the denial of an IDEA parent, which has been in some cases been a per se substantive denial of a FAPE. Essentially, they don't involve the IDEA parent in the services that are being provided in that placement, and they fail to provide a FAPE for that child because there's been no effective education decision maker. We've had cases concerning children in solitary confinement who have been deprived of any education and have received compensatory education service awards for the failure to provide, again, a free appropriate public education. So a lot of cases have come up in that context with regard to children in the juvenile justice system. In addition, one of the overlooked protections is under Section 504 in the Americans with Disabilities Act. And just to remind everyone that if a student has a qualifying disability, which is very broadly defined under the law and could include a child who has alcoholism, a child suffering from depression, that they're entitled to accommodations in school so that they are able to make the same progress as other students. They can't be excluded, be denied the benefits of, or subject to discrimination by virtue of their disability. So that's something that sometimes comes up in this context. Also, of course, we have constitutional rights that don't go away because you're in a placement. So every state constitution has an education clause that guarantees youth of a particular age, in many states it's up to age 21, the right to an education. And the denial of that education is a denial of a property right, and therefore it's subject to challenge. So we see in the state constitution, it depends on what your state clause says. There are education clauses, for example, in Florida that talk about a specific quality of education, or sometimes it's a discussion of a uniform system of education or a uniform education. So it depends on what your state education clause says, but that's something that is subject to challenge. And certainly the denial of a right to education has been deemed and is a fundamental right. Therefore, that's subject to challenge. So you see under the U.S. Constitution, again, a deprivation of a state property interest. And it also talks about minimally adequate or reasonable training to ensure safety and freedom from undue restraint. There are examples of using that case, which unfortunately has been very narrowly construed, where the people have challenged that and said you're depriving these students of an education, and they try to use sort of that case to say these are not minimally adequate education that you're providing in this context. And then we have, again, another example under the federal law, where a state law was used to create, constitutionally protected property interest. And in that case, the court ordered the state to develop a plan to ensure that each inmate, in that case it was juveniles who were in adult correctional facilities, received the education to which they were entitled. Many of them in that case were deprived of any education. In addition, just to highlight, of course, we still have an equal protection clause, and that's in both U.S. Constitution as well as state constitutions. So to think about ways to use those constitutional rights in this context is really an imperative. Next, wanted to highlight Title I Part D of the new Every Student Succeeds Act, which, as many of you know, was the first overhaul to the Elementary and Secondary Education Act in 12 years. So this replaced No Child Left Behind. It was adopted in December of 2015, and it has going into effect. Some provisions are already in effect as of December 10th, but then a lot of the accountability assessment measures are being determined now, actually by the state plans that are being developed in all states. So a lot of this will not go into effect until the next academic year, the next school year. But just to remind everyone, Title I Part D, it's a funding stream for state agencies to redistribute funds to ensure that those who have locally operated juvenile facilities are improving educational services for youth and institutions, improving transitions between juvenile facilities and the community, preventing dropout. It's now been expanded to include not only children who are in that system, but also children at risk of being placed in that system. There's also a Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. Again, these are not legal rights. We talk about them as more protections and opportunities for students. But that offers an array of employment services targeted at the nation's most vulnerable workers. It requires a minimum of 75% of state and local youth funding be spent on services for out-of-school youth ages 16 to 24. So the new protections of ESSA are important for several reasons. First, I wanted to note that the regulations were recently adopted on November the 28th. So the new date for the revised date for the state plan is now September 18th of 2017. So by that date, all state plans have to be submitted to the federal government. Major overhaul of ESSA because it shifts accountability from the federal level to the states. Two things I wanted to call out with respect to ESSA, just so that everyone knows the context. Essentially, it delineates the accountability and assessment measures for students. So in this case, it's saying that states must develop what those assessments look like. They have to define what they are. They can use some local, they can use SATs, they can use other standardized state test scores, state testing that they use. It looks at teacher effectiveness. It looks at interventions for those underperforming schools, and it allows states also to think about a fourth measure that they could add. So that doesn't need to be academic. It could be school climate. It could look at disproportionality. It could look at a lot of other areas. So just to take a step back to remind everyone that that's a really important point of advocacy at the state level at this juncture. But with regard to the accountability measures, it talks about interventions for failing schools. And so these are sort of the criteria, the factors falling in the lowest 5%, or less than 2/3 of students graduate, being a Title I school, when any of those, and with a subgroup that's chronically underachieving. And we can talk about who those subgroups are too. It does not include students in the juvenile justice system, but they have added children in foster care, children in the military, children experiencing homelessness to the subgroups. So it calls for a comprehensive support from the state when those schools don't meet one of those three criteria. So I'm just calling that out because there may be some schools in juvenile facilities who fall into this category. So it's something to think about. And also, as I highlighted here, states may add additional statewide categories of schools beyond comprehensive and targeted support for improvement. So that's an area of advocacy. In addition, to look at graduation rates. States will be required to incorporate students in juvenile justice facilities in a school's graduation rate calculation. So that's extremely important. And if a facility offers diplomas, then it, as a school, should be looking at what the graduation rate calculation is for that school. If it does not grant diplomas, then students are looking at the graduation rates for their home schools. And by the way, with respect to those subgroups, that is something that's looked at. You look at the testing. It's not a summative score. You look at a lot of different measures, and it's looking at it over a 3-year period. So states receiving Title I Part D must ensure that youth in juvenile justice system benefit from increased coordination between facilities and home school districts. So they need to have smooth transitions both when they enter a juvenile justice facility and when they exit and go back to the community schools. So here's what's new under Title I Part D for these students. The educational assessment that state agencies must establish procedures for youth to be assessed to identify educational needs when they enter a juvenile justice facility when practicable. So that is something that will be defined in a state plan. What are those educational assessments? When will they be accomplished? What does that mean? And I know there's been some advocacy around that issue and when they would be done and what that means when practicable. With regard to records transfer, that relevant academic records must transfer with the youth to the facility. So that's something to look at. And you'll see that I've highlighted there NDTAC as an important website to go to find out more information about all of these provisions. On reentry planning, facilities must work with LEAs, local education agencies, so school districts or charter schools, so the youth education is not interrupted when they exit the facility. So there needs to be better coordination in terms of having an actual reentry plan so that students are staying on track in order to graduate and in order to go back to their community schools. Credit transfer. State and local agencies must assure credits earned in placement are recognized and transferred to their community schools. So that's an incredibly important provision for these youth because so often those credits are not transferring. So timely and appropriate re-enrollment. So state education agencies must establish procedures, new policies to ensure students leaving juvenile justice facilities are timely re-enrolled in a program that meets their needs so that they're not thrown into alternative education for disruptive youth or that they're not placed in the wrong at the wrong grade level in the wrong classroom, but that they're timely re-enrolled in a program that's effective for them. And also that they offer programs to facilitate the transition of re-entering youth. So defining what that means again is really taking place in your state plan. Family involvement was also highlighted, expands the purpose of Title I Part D to include family and community involvement. This is such a critical protection for these youth to ensure that family members are involved in what their placement is at a juvenile justice placement and also involved in that reentry planning. They also talked about teachers for students with disabilities and special needs in state institutions, including correctional facilities and community day schools, must be appropriately licensed or certified. As many of you know, highly qualified teachers is no longer in the new iteration of ESSA. However, states are determining what those criteria are, and certainly still under IDEA, they must be properly certified. So dual status youth, you must keep records of youth who are involved in both the child welfare and juvenile justice systems and educational institutions to provide targeted services that assist those dual status youth. And then there were also some other issues highlighted here, pay for success initiatives, which I'm not going to go into right now because it's too lengthy. But if you wanted to find out more information, we can certainly provide it. But it sort of talks about private funders who are providing bonds for those initiatives and what those look like. It calls out higher education partnerships to ensure post-secondary success and workforce development. And it talks about the at-risk definition, which I mentioned earlier, expanded to include youth who are at risk of being adjudicated dependent or delinquent. So that's important. It also talks about educational opportunities upon reentry, that LEA seeking funding must partner with higher ed institutions to promote post-secondary and workforce success for reentering students, including opportunities for youth exiting facilities to enroll in secondary coursework, etc., and also to make more career and technical available in juvenile justice placements is another area. And then with respect to high school diplomas, that state and local agencies, and including correctional facilities, must assist youth in attaining traditional high school diplomas. So what does that look like? What does that entail? And one accountability standard for local education agencies is to increase the number of youth attaining high school diplomas. Of course, that's throughout ESSA. and to include that local and state jurisdictions are collecting program evaluation data on the number of youth served who graduate on time. So one of the issues to look at with respect to juvenile justice placements is to ensure that we're looking at whether that's actually taking place to support students to graduate. I also just wanted to highlight one last thing, which is a new OJJDP policy that the Justice Department had issued. And I know that folks on this call may be very familiar with this. But it's important to highlight because it talks about states being required to annually monitor 100% of facilities that are covered by these grants, by the JJDP grants. So I think it's important to look at that, and I just wanted folks to have the link to that policy, because currently there are only 33 states that actually adhere to that standard, that are doing the compliance monitoring and ensuring that they are complying with 28 state plan requirements in order to receive a formula grant award. So again, this is an area of intervention and advocacy where we can ensure that they're actually being monitored for compliance with those plan requirements, and another way to improve the quality of education being provided to students. So now I'm going to turn it over to Christina, who is going to talk to us about the Blueprint for Change.
Thanks, Maura. Let me pull up the right screen. Can folks tell me if they're seeing a clean version of this slide? Okay, great, thanks. All right, so my name is Christina Moon. I'm a staff attorney at Education Law Center, and I have the pleasure of introducing to you a little preview of the Blueprint, this new resource that we put together. It was modeled after the successful Blueprint for Education Success for Youth in Foster Care, as Maura mentioned. And it was created incorporating feedback from providers and partners across the country to actually put together this blueprint. Okay, so the blueprint itself presents 10 goals that set forth a broad framework for promoting education success for young people involved in the JJ system. And for each of those 10 goals, there are a number of benchmarks that, if achieved, would help indicate progress toward improving these educational outcomes. And we kind of think of the benchmarks as more specific and concrete policies or strategies that help achieve the goals. Also included along with the 10 goals and the numerous benchmarks for each are over 100 pages of resources promising policies and practices for each of the goals. So what we have available to share with attendees via email following the webinar is a pretty PDF of these goals and benchmarks. And then soon to follow in 2017, we're creating a searchable website that will include the same 100 pages of resources. And you can review these by goal. So if you go into the website, you'll be able to choose each individual goal and review resources, policies, or practices that help implement that goal. You can also search by your individual state for promising practices or resources already in place in your state that have been submitted to us. And you can also search by keyword for any particular issue or practice that you find to be relevant or want more resources about. And for each of these goals, the resources are hyperlinked for more information, and they'll also be hosted on our Blueprint website. So we hope to be a single kind of central location that you can come to find all of this information. And so because we're lawyers, we do need to provide a little bit of a disclaimer, and that is that the resources, policies, and practices that are presented in the blueprint are presented to spark ideas for reform and replication, but the center has not formally evaluated the effectiveness of each individual sample policy or practice that we're going to present in this resource. So an overview, kind of short titles for these 10 goals for educational success for youth in the juvenile justice system. It's important that youth voice is heard and represented throughout the process. It's important that youth have adult support throughout their experience with the JJ system, that youth be educated in the community wherever possible, and that in those community schools, youth have full opportunities for educational success and don't have barriers just because they are involved in the JJ system. We need a quality education within facilities and placements and supportive school environments for these youth. It's important that youth in JJ systems have career pathway support and post-secondary access. They need smooth transitions between their home schools and schools within the JJ placements. And then we also call out the need to protect especially vulnerable youth populations. So today, because we only have limited time together, we're going to go through and highlight just a few of these goals and some benchmarks and examples of the types of resources and policies or practices that you'll see on the live website when it's available. So for example, the first 5 blueprint goals in full. Youth are informed and entrusted to make decisions about their own education and future. Youth have adult support in their education before, during, and after involvement in the juvenile justice system. And after being charged or adjudicated delinquent, youth remain in the same school whenever feasible or enroll in a new school in their home community. Youth involved in the juvenile justice system who are educated in the community receive access to the full range of educational opportunities and support. And 5, youth in juvenile justice placements receive a high-quality educational experience that enables them to stay on track academically. So of these first 5, I'm going to speak in detail just about the 2 that are highlighted. So the second calls out adult support and the importance there. And on the left side of your screen, you'll see some examples that I've pulled of the benchmarks that we believe are the strategies that can help implement and achieve the educational outcomes that we're looking for. So it's important that youth are supported by parents who are engaged and have received information and training about their youth's educational rights. And it's directly across from that, one of the types of examples that you'll see with our blueprint is this national resource from NDTAC, the National Technical Assistance Center for the Education of Neglected and Delinquent Youth. And they've created a facility toolkit for engaging families. So on the blueprint website, this resource is linked as well as hosted on the site so that you have access to that. The next benchmark, when a youth parent is available but requires supports to fully engage, the system and other stakeholders collaborate to provide that access and support. The same facility toolkit for engaging families is a great resource on that point. Benchmark 2.3, when even with supports, the parent is not available to participate in the youth's education, another legally authorized education decision maker is identified, taking the youth's preference into consideration as a priority. And an example resource provided on that point is also here on your screen. The Pennsylvania Juvenile Court Procedural Rules require, for example, the juvenile court to make findings to ensure the stability and appropriateness of the juvenile's education. And in Louisiana, an interesting program, community reintegration program by the Youth Empowerment Project, assigns each young person a youth advocate from their same neighborhood who provides wraparound case management services and serves as a mentor and advocate for the youth, assists with school re-enrollment, and other issues that might come up. The next example goal from the first 5 that I wanted to highlight Youth in juvenile justice placements receive a high-quality educational experience that enables them to stay on track academically. And as Maura highlighted earlier, this is a real concern across the country. Benchmark here calls out that youth in placement schools are provided the same high-quality academics and the same state-aligned curriculum and instructional time that would be provided in traditional public schools. And then we have a number of resources, both national and some from different states, that provide resources for how we might think about implementing these benchmarks to reach the goal. In Arizona, for example, there's a multi-jurisdictional administrative and fiscal coordination and oversight supported by this formal agreement to define each party's responsibility in developing detention education programs and using funds as needed. Another national resource, the State Correctional Educational Self-Assessment, is provided, and this is a tool to self-assess your own state's existing special education and related services provided to youth with disabilities in juvenile detention facilities. Another state example, Louisiana, Educational Accountability and Rehabilitation Act, recently in 2016, includes standards for oversight, accountability, and quality control of educational services within JJ facilities, addresses school performance score calculating, and creates a school report card. Calls out the creation also of an accountability team specifically to assess and monitor JJ progress. So this is another example that you can use to consider if appropriate for your own state or jurisdiction. And then another national resource from the Department of Education, guiding principles for providing high quality education in juvenile justice secure care settings. The blueprint goals 6 through 10 include the following. Youth in juvenile justice placements are educated in a supportive, positive school environment where they feel safe and have a voice. Youth have access to high-quality career pathways programs, especially within juvenile justice placements. Youth receive supports to prepare for, enter, and complete post-secondary education and training. And youth have smooth transitions between home schools and schools in juvenile justice placements and receive effective reentry planning and supports. And then finally, all marginalized youth, and particularly youth of color, youth with disabilities, girls, lesbian, gay, bisexual, and queer identifying youth, gender nonconforming and transgender youth, English language learners, youth who are involved with both child welfare and juvenile justice systems, and those with intersectional identities are educated in their home schools rather than being disproportionately assigned juvenile justice placements and receive the services, support, and protections they need to address their unique barriers to educational success. And I'll come back to the 3 that are highlighted here to provide examples. 7 addresses the career pathways programs that are important for our youth in the JJ system. These youth need to receive meaningful career exploration, career planning, guidance, and job training services, and 21st century skills to identify, obtain, and sustain employment. And the youth, including in placement, need to have access to career and technical education programs that offer industry-recognized credentials and certificates. And as we know, that's unfortunately not the case for a lot of youth across the country right now. So some examples of how to implement this goal and these benchmarks. In Louisiana, New Orleans, the Youth Study Center School implements career and technical education options with some virtual learning to overcome space constraints and offers college and post-secondary courses through outside partnerships with local colleges and online credit-bearing courses. And in Florida, the career education for youth and juvenile justice programs are overseen by the local school districts, and they provide guidelines based on the length of stay for the youth in the particular types of programs. So for prevention and day treatment programs, they have to provide at a minimum career readiness and exploration opportunities. If the minimum length of stay is 9 months, they must provide courses that lead to pre-apprentice certifications and industry certifications. And if less than 9 months, they may but are not required to provide these courses. And less than 40 days, It could be limited to tutorial, remediation activities, career employability, skills instruction, counseling, and transition services. So these are some things, some programs to consider when looking at your own jurisdiction and how you might want to advocate for these youth and their access to career pathway programs. Number 9 calls out that need for youth to have smooth transitions between home schools and schools and juvenile justice placements and receive effective reentry planning and support. We know this is where a lot of our students are caught and end up bottoming out. So the benchmark here on the left-hand side of your screen, youth receive robust education planning as soon as they enter any JJ placement, whether short or long-term, to ensure continuation of their then current credit-bearing coursework, as well as career technical training programs. And the resource that we have highlighted here, among many others that will be on the Blueprint website when live. Pennsylvania Education Law Center here, our colleagues created an educational aftercare and reintegration toolkit for JJ professionals. And this assists youth in that transition from the JJ facility to a traditional school, and helps the child serving providers identify these educational issues that often arise. Another benchmark here on the right side of your screen, youth should receive full or partial credit for coursework completed in their prior school, or credit waivers for those electives that aren't required by state law. And the youth's credits should promptly transfer to a school or juvenile justice placement. And for example, in California, under legislation passed in 2014, public school districts are required to accept credit for full or partial coursework completed by the students while attending a juvenile court school. There is a standard state transcript that facilitates this process, and students receive a diploma from the school they attended prior to detention. And the legislation specifically calls out that students can't be denied re-enrollment or readmission to a public school simply because they had contact with the JJ system. There are a lot of other great examples, particularly on this transitional point and reentry point on the website that will be made available. For example, in Maine, there are some reintegration teams. When a juvenile is released from a correctional facility, the department has to notify the superintendent of the school, and within 10 days, the superintendent convenes a reintegration team to carry out some planning. The team has to consist of the administrator of the school or a designee, and at least one of a teacher who will be actually working with the student on return, a parent, guardian, or custodian, and the guidance counselor. So a lot more programs and resources are going to be available when our website is live. Finally, we wanted to highlight that there are benchmarks within and supporting each of the goals that address the particular concerns or barriers of these vulnerable populations. So throughout goals 1 through 9, we call out students with disabilities needs, particular rights and benchmarks, strategies needed to meet the needs of English language learners, and all of these other vulnerable groups that we list here. But we really thought that these were so important, so critical that we also wanted to highlight them in a separate goal so that advocates can use this as a tool of their own as well. So protecting especially vulnerable youth, it's so important that youth attend schools free from discrimination based on race, sex, sexual orientation, gender presentation, national origin, language, disability, or other characteristics, and they're educated in facilities that engage in a data analysis and independent review to survey youth and assess programs to identify concerns and bias. Additionally, staff are trained in race-positive, culturally competent, gender-responsive, trauma-informed, strengths-based, and developmentally appropriate responses to any behavior from youth. And all of these youth, from all of these different identifying populations, have mentors who are culturally competent to empower and support them and understand their strengths and unique barriers to educational success. particularly with regard to specific populations, youth of color are offered programs and instruction free from racial and ethnic bias that could lead to disproportionate out-of-home placement of students of color. And youth with disabilities are not segregated or excluded based on their disability or behavior that is a manifestation of their disability. Youth who are English language learners receive appropriate interpretation and translation services, ESOL instruction and modifications in career technical education programs. And youth who are permitted to participate in activities, programs, and facilities youth are permitted to participate in activities, programs, and facilities consistent with their stated gender identity. We think that, and there are more of these particular benchmarks as well, but we found it so important to call out these particular, especially vulnerable populations, so that hopefully this is a tool for you as advocates working on behalf of these youth. So that is a very quick overview of the 10 goals that we have presented for educational success for youth in the juvenile justice systems, and some of the benchmarks that we think will be helpful in reaching those goals, as well as the types of examples and resources that are going to be available with many, many more in an interactive, dynamic website format for everyone. So what's next for the Legal Center? All of you participating in the webinar today will receive a PDF of the blueprint goals and benchmarks via email along with the slides of this presentation. And then as soon as possible, based on our website developers, in 2017 we'll also publicize the launch of a searchable website with all of these example policies and practices. We are continuing to collect and create resources and tools for you, the practitioners. So some of the resources that we can offer along that way, please do consider joining and using our listserv. And I've provided the Google Groups address here on the screen. You can also email us directly at the LCYJE, that's Legal Center for Youth Justice and Education Blueprint, at ejcenter.org, with any additional policies, practices, or helpful resources that you think should be included in the Blueprint website. And all of those that have been shared with us to date by practitioners across the last several months have been incorporated in this resource, so they'll be going live. And then please also look out for information from us about a litigators convening in 2017. So I believe we have a little bit of time for questions. Is those, I'm checking with Chelsea, if we have any questions from the audience, Maura and Chelsea? Yeah, Christine, I emailed them to you, Maura.
The state education agencies and local education agencies are implementing this. So, and another question came up about who's monitoring compliance with ESSA. So essentially, it's the federal agency, the Department of Education, that is auditing compliance by the state. They're going to review the state plans. They will either accept them or tell them they have to change them. Then they are ensuring that they are audited, that they are complying with those state plans. So essentially, the state education agency is the insurer. However, the local education agencies also have specific responsibilities pursuant to the state plan with regard to conducting the assessments, ensuring 95% participation, and then, of course, developing the interventions in cases where you have low-performing schools. So essentially, the state plan will articulate what those evidence-based interventions must be and what they should look like when you find a school that falls into one of those three criterion. And then the local education agency will actually work with educators and with parents and with the state to develop what those interventions will look like. So it's essentially being implemented at the by the state education agency. With regard to youth in juvenile justice placements, it's largely the state education agency that is on the hook for ensuring that they've complied with those provisions of ESSA that we discussed today. Another issue that came up is whether the law defines what timely means in terms of enrollment, and it is not really defined under the new federal regulations that came out November 28th. However, that's another issue that really should be defined by state policy that's issued pursuant to ESSA with regard to implementation of Title I Part D. Then the last question that came in was talk about services to youth who are at risk of dependency or delinquency. And that's a really excellent question. Some examples would be diversion programs, truancy programs, mentorship programs, but it really is a wide range of programs that are really designed to ensure that children are not going to prevent them from going into the dependency or the delinquency system. And NDTAC has, and the federal guidance on this, has defined that widely. One of the things that another a person had called out, which I think is really important, is to say that we need to think about driving more dollars for transition services to support and implement what's in the new ESSA provisions. So to find ways to allocate funding specifically for that, to ensure that we're supporting students when they return to their community schools, to do that graduation planning, to ensure that they are properly placed is very, very important. So I think everyone had raised some really important questions and issues here. I also wanted to ask everyone on the call, if there are examples that folks would like to share of things that they are doing in their states that they know about that are, a few of the states have developed their state plans under ESSA, or if you have examples of some of the goals and the benchmarks that Christina discussed and highlighted from the blueprint, we really, really do want to hear from all of you, because this tool will be so much, obviously is so important when you have a searchable database like this that's based on these national and state laws and policies and also programs, for us to hear from you about what is working and what's not working, and to learn what's being done at your state level and also at the local jurisdiction level, to see what's happening to support students and what's been effective. So I just wanted to throw that out to everyone, and if there is anyone on the call who wanted to unmute just to share some examples of what's going on in their particular jurisdiction, say, what state you're from or what county, and share what is going on, we'd really, really love to hear about it. Christina, did you want to add anything?
No, I don't have anything else. We'd be happy also, I'm not sure if attendees have the capacity to unmute on the call, but we'd be happy to receive those examples by email, and I've moved us to the contact information stage or slide. You can email those to us, and then we can incorporate them into the Blueprint website and searchable database for everyone, or share them on our listserv, JJ Education.
Yeah, that would be great. We really appreciate everyone's participation today.
If we don't have any further questions coming through.
Was there any comments or questions or anyone who wanted to share anything? Okay, well, with that, we would just like to thank you for your participation today, and we really look forward to hearing from you and having further discussions about this important topic. So thank you so much.